Ecosystems. We have, again, Ana Jimenez Santamaria. She's project manager, senior project manager at the Linux Foundation. We have Claire. Thank you, Claire. Claire comes from the inner source and open source advocacy at the Open Ireland Network. And last but not least, we have Melanie Wolnick she's a facilitator at the Open Rail Association. So thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us on this panel, and we're going to talk about innovation, openness, and collaboration. I wanted to start off with a question for our panelists, which is, in open source ecosystems and spaces, we talk a lot about collaboration, we talk a lot about transparency, but just because something is open source, a project is open source, doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be transparent. So you can hide a lot, even if your final source code is open source. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that there's any collaboration happening whatsoever. You can have an open source project that is created, maintained exclusively by one individual, or just as frequently by one company. So the first question I wanted to start us off with is just, how do you make sure that you actually do have transparency and collaboration in an open source ecosystem? Claire, do you want to start?
Well, that's a hard one, because I don't think you can necessarily force that on particular scenarios. I think it's interesting because not all open source projects actually, for example, need collaboration or want collaboration. So I think the first thing is for projects to be very clear about what their goals are. Maybe they are just being built to scratch someone's individual itch and the creators have zero intent to make those part of the open ecosystem. But if something is being built for, I suppose, to seed an open ecosystem and to seed innovation, then people probably should think about what best practices are for both transparency and to enable collaboration. And I do think that there's a lot of guidance involved in that. People have to understand what those best practices look like. But I also think that there's probably a role to help people do that, because it's not enough to just have it be ready for collaboration. Sometimes you need to be able to identify other individuals who you want to collaborate with, and these are people system problems, not technology problems. So I suppose that would be my take on some of those challenges.
Okay, yeah, so as an Open Rail Association, we are pretty new. We just funded in 2024, so I think we make some experiences on that topic.
From Linux Foundation perspective, we've got many organizations in the past, right, like coming to us and thinking that open sourcing a project is just publishing on a repo, and that's all. I think that mindset is slightly changing. I think organizations are taking more knowledge about that is not enough. One of the first things that organizations are more aware about right now are, for instance, the changing licenses. Like, you might have heard about the Terraform or Redis use case that happened a couple of years ago, and how this triggered the whole industry, right? Like, and that was the question of, okay, it was open source. People thought that because it was open source, that was all, and it wasn't, because if, for instance, there are red flags around the diversity of contributors, that was one of the things that happened, is that open source? And it talks to the need of and the importance of collaboration. But then there is, I think, like the value of foundation, and talking about Linux Foundation, but all the foundation, like Eclipse Foundation, Apache Foundation, that I think provides value to this. How can improve this collaboration is providing governance models and licensing standards that make sure that the project will, it's more likely to the project to become open source even in the long term, because they have a wide diversity of contributors because of the standards and the governance models that foundations provides. And for instance, one example was with the OpenTOFU, right? Like Terraform the company decided the next versions to become proprietary with the business software license, and then the community reacted and said, no, we're gonna keep moving the next versions open source. We're gonna create a new thing that is OpenTofu, that is open source. And they decided to host it under a foundation that was Linux Foundation and call it like OpenTofu. Like, I think that's one takeaway.
Well, from my perspective, I think it depends what you're using open source for. So for me, open source is a means to an end, and then depends on the organization's objectives. They might be using open source in one way or another. So there are many different reasons as to why a company or organization decides to launch its open source project or collaborate with others or open source something. I think they're all legitimate reasons. There is no better open source than other, as long as it abides to the to the standard definition. And then, increasingly, especially here in Europe, I think but in other parts of the world as well, we are sometimes having to face the decision of how we exactly use open source for something else. So how do we make sure, for instance, that open source at European level really becomes a tool to encourage and consolidate innovation among European companies? Innovation that then can be transformed into products and make the European tech companies more competitive. And when you approach open source as a tool for making European tech companies more competitive, then you start to have thinking about what really collaboration and transparency means in that context, when you are managing that kind of open source project. The experience we have, for instance, as part of the, well, who in the room knows or has heard about the IPSAI Cloud? Important project of common European interest on next generation cloud infrastructure and services, 4 or 5 people. Okay, it's the largest open source project in the history of the European Union. We have 3 billion euros, 3,000 million euros for the first time in Europe to produce open source together. It's a project that was launched a couple of years ago. It's that family of projects about semiconductors and hydrogen, when Europe really needs to invest something in a market to fix a market failure. So we're getting these 3 billion euros for 120 companies across 12 member states to produce a European open source cloud and edge platform. But it's confidential, everything we do. And so we are doing open source together. We're putting together all these different components, building a very beautiful stack of technologies controlled by European companies, but open source technologies developed by European companies. But then there are limitations to the things we can discuss outside of this group of companies with our competitors at some point. So in this case, it's a practical challenge of, yeah, we are producing open source. We are producing open source together as the only way to make different companies, even competitors within Europe, to collaborate on some common baseline technological stack. But then we have to question, okay, how much transparency, how much collaboration, how much dependency we want to create with third parties. So it's an interesting time to think about all this stuff. Yeah.
So I'm really glad that you brought up innovation, because that's the topic of our panel. But I really want to back up a little bit, because also when you talk to people, there's almost an assumption that when you have collaboration and when you have transparency, this will automatically make things more innovative. It will help innovation. Can you explain, all of you panelists, why that is? Why does collaboration and transparency contribute to innovation? Anna, do you want to start?
So I think I want to take back to the story that I've shared, right? Like, I feel like that is a good use case on why this is important. You as consumers of open source, your organization as consumers of open source is gaining a technical depth that you don't see or the organization doesn't see, but it's there. And just because you take an open source project and put it into the baseline of the project you are relying on, or you're providing service to customers or to citizens, if you're a public administration, doesn't mean that that project is going to be there forever. So I think having a project that has a good sense or a good indicator of open collaboration and is transparent gives the power of this organization to know if that is a project that they want to still using or provide support or just discard because they're still seeing some red lights in terms of the collaboration, the diversity of the contributions. I feel it's a good indicator of risk and a good way to manage risk under the software supply chain of organizations nowadays.
In our sector, we normally when we collaborate with each other, often it's very formalistic. Because our business is not software; it's iron, steel, and these hard things. And we all have the same challenges in our countries. So maybe, and through open source software, we have the possibility to, as an Open Rail Association, to create a room where we can collaborate and work together on a different level under the open source principles and with the values. And so we can learn to work together on an international level. And this, I think, this provides innovation and new ideas because everybody brings we bring things together and build upon each other's ideas.
I was also going to say, so alongside my work in Open Ireland Network, which is about trying to promote innovation and collaboration through open source for innovation in Ireland, I also work with Curious, which is a network of individuals who work in academic open source program offices. And I think one of the biggest learnings for me about open source, which I didn't quite get maybe when I first started in this area, was that transparency by its nature just helps the spread of knowledge and practice and information quicker. So if you're thinking about innovating as quickly as you need to, then having things be transparent not only allows for that dissemination of knowledge and sharing of knowledge more easily without friction, but it allows for a consistency and a coherence around what is considered to be best practice. Which maybe brings me to my second point around collaboration, alongside what folks have already said. We heard a lot today about the complexity of what's required to build resilient, trustworthy software. And I think today innovation doesn't mean a shiny new idea that someone put up overnight and just whacked it up over, in his bedroom or his or her bedroom and stuck it out there for the world to enjoy. It's much more complex. And if you really want to build truly usable innovation that's really worthwhile and resilient, then you need to collaborate with a whole load of different subject matter experts. So you need to not only have the technical expertise, you need to know about the citizen needs, you need to know about the domain needs, you need to know about the regulations, you need to know about the security requirements. And I don't think any one person can do that by themselves, really, these days. So I think collaboration is inherent now to actually get innovation that's useful.
I mean, from my perspective, again, looking from the mostly on the European context, I don't see any other way in which innovation can take place in Europe in a sustainable or in an effective way if it's not through open source. And many companies, I mean, that's a challenge because many companies in Europe, as many of you know perfectly well, are very, very comfortable being mere consumers of open source produced somewhere else. But it's very difficult for them to become active developers or maintainers or active players in these ecosystems. But we need that because the particularities of the European market. So we don't have these large companies or large investors like in the US, where a few companies can invest a lot of resources in producing some breakthrough innovation. We don't have the political, how to say, push or that in some of our Chinese competitors enjoy from the government. So it's an environment where necessarily we need to do things together, and the only possible way to do that for technological innovation is open source, despite the lack of experience in the continent in doing this in an active way and taking this responsibility of building these things together. That brings the challenge that we need to, well, it's a challenge, but also an opportunity to bring together the producers of technology and the eventual future consumers of that technology. And that's something quite unique in some of the projects that we have in Europe. In the one that I was mentioning before, the IPSAI, for instance, we are producing this technology. We have cloud providers, telco operators, tech providers, but we also have end users. So we have Airbus, we have Fincantieri, we have the Mondragon Corporation, we have Deutsche Bahn. So these are end users that are actively collaborating with tech, cloud, and telco operators to build the technology that they know they need. So that kind of ecosystem, in a context where innovation has, for definition, I mean, by definition, to be done by a group of companies, that's something unique that we have in Europe and we can exploit.
So Claire, you had talked about how you can put measures in place to encourage collaboration. Can you go into that a little bit more? Tell us more about how an organization that really, really wants collaboration to be happening can encourage it.
Well, I think when we're thinking about maybe the skills required to do open source, I think there's a broad recognition that it's not just technical skills, but it's ability to know how to work in an open source way, how to engage with communities, and the fact that each community may have its own different unique norms and customs that you may need to be aware of. But I also think that the idea of, as Alberto was saying, you know, this idea of bringing together the folks that are creating it and the folks that are using it, and being able to provide opportunities for those discussions to happen, particularly if those users may not be involved in the communities or hanging out on GitHub with issues or whatever. Maybe folks may be even outside the domain of software development altogether. And I do think that in those scenarios, to make that collaboration happen, someone needs to step up and make it happen. I'm not 100% convinced that I should step back. I do think innovation happens organically when you make things out in the wild, and people will take things and do amazing things. I think more innovation happens if you support that activity. So it's not that it can't happen without supports, but more would happen if you gave it support and if you created the opportunities for connections, discussions, best practices, education. There was a lot of talk about funding here today, but you know, a lot of that funding is going already directly into creating the technology, but I would love to see more of it happen in building the networks, the people networks, the infrastructure that enables that collaboration to happen between a very diverse set of actors to help that innovation really make sense.
And Alberto, you talked a little bit about the specific European context related to innovation. I was wondering if you could go a little bit deeper into what's different in Europe, what's specific about the European context compared to North America or compared to China, for example?
I would say Europe is a bloody mess, isn't it? But it's a nice one.
There are worse places.
Of course. It's a mess where things can happen differently. And I was thinking about the title of the panel. So we're talking about sustainable innovation, and that's good. Ethical innovation is also interesting. And one of the things we have in Europe is also, through this need to collaborate between different companies, and sometimes not only companies, but also public administrations and other people in the ecosystem, is that it is more likely that if something is going in the wrong direction, someone will raise their hand and will say, guys, this might be a bad idea. And that, I'm not that sure it happens so easily in both the US or the Chinese context, for instance, within the organizations that lead innovation in those regions. So that's something that we also have to embrace and use through the whole process of innovation in Europe, but also as a way to attract people from other regions to Europe. We can do things differently. We can be competitive. We can do things together, and we'll have to do that through open source. But we can also do that in a more responsible and ethical way than other regions of the world. And in that exercise, we were talking about Japan before, but in that exercise, I think already the European Commission and many companies in Europe have already identified that we need to enroll other democratic countries around the world. So Japan and South Korea, for instance, are two of the strategic partners for Europe in that innovation. Because they are ready, they're doing very nice things, and they are ready to collaborate with us in offering a different model. And we also have in Europe this kind of heritage, cultural heritage that's very different from what the US companies and the Chinese companies feed their ideas. And it's the social aspect of innovation. So how we understand from Europe and other democratic partners in the world that technology might be useful for people. So you have to think about if something is going to be harmful, I mean, what are going to be the consequences of that? How disruptive something has to be or is going to be, or whether or not something has to be disruptive at all in some senses. So I think that's something very, very unique that we have in Europe. So it's a good mess in a sense, so we have to use that for this sustainable innovation.
Melanie, I had a question for you as well, which is, what does innovation look like in something that we'd say, quote unquote, is a legacy industry? So an industry like railways that isn't probably shipping new features every week, at least I hope not. What does innovation look like and what's different about it when we're thinking in this sort of legacy industry, but also an industry in which safety is very important?
Yes, I think for us it's new that we collaborate on this European level, that we have different company cultures, different country cultures, different understandings of hierarchy, for example, and that we just focus on the challenge we have to or the solution we have to find. And within the Open Rail Association, we are able to practice this kind of work in. And so I think this is innovative for us, for the industry, and for the sector. And I also think that we need it for mobility, borderless mobility in Europe, and for a strong Europe. The railway is very important, I think. And it's also important that we connect people physically so they can connect with each other, talk to each other, learn from each other. And yeah, that's the thing where I think we can contribute to innovation.
Thank you. And we are going to take some questions from you, from the audience. We have Luis, who has a microphone. Does anyone have a question for our panelists? You don't even have to come to the microphone in the middle. If not, I have another question. No guinea pigs? Okay, well, I have a question for Anna. No, we have a guinea pig.
Icebreaker.
I just felt like I should ask a question then, just because you were going to be left on your own. I think for this, based on what you've heard this morning, because I think there was some really interesting pieces that came up through the course of the day, and Adriana's piece in terms of what's happening in Germany, like the bits that are like useful or replicable for this, that say, so I'm from Ireland, small country, 5.2 million people. What's the playbook? Because I think we're probably never going to have the level of investment to kind of drive or put the institutions and structures in that others would have, or to do the research to support it. So it's not like we're trying for a cut and paste here, but as much as possible, we don't want to reinvent wheels. But also to Claire's point, it's a cultural fit. what's going to work for Ireland, and how do we fit those things in. So it's really about, like, what is that? Like, what are the structures that you see are essential for this?
Can you summarize your question in one sentence?
That would have been good, wouldn't it? So the question is, based on what you've heard from this morning, from the other speakers this morning, so in particular Adriana's, like, what are the structures that we need to put in place at a country and then at an EU level to make this work?
Anna, do you want to take that? Or
I think
I'll let you decide.
I think it's linked with the discussion we had yesterday, right? In the preamble to the event. There are a number of discussions now at the European level about how to, for instance, manage critical open source, right? How to, for instance, use the experience of the Sovereign Tech Fund to help maintainers of different open source projects to be more sustainable. From my personal perspective, again, that's personal perspective, what I would really like to see I would really like to see a Linux Foundation move their headquarters to Europe. If that's not happening, I would like to see a European alternative as an open source foundation for...
Eclipse Foundation. They moved their headquarters to Europe.
Yes. We'd like to see a European foundation designed for instance, all the different research and development projects that are being funded with EU money, to have a place where they can be nurtured and helped to develop their technology, but also to get to know each other and make the connection with the European companies that are using these technologies to develop or define their new products. So that's the step that I think is missing. The connection, on the one hand, the European companies using more European open source technologies, so open source technologies developed by European communities and companies. On the other hand, more alignment with the research and innovation that we do in Europe in lower TRLs to help develop those technologies that are being used by industry. And that structure is missing because the different players now in the ecosystem have other priorities, not creating that continuum when it comes to innovation and open source in Europe. So that's my take.
Any more questions? I think we have time for one more. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I had one final question for Anna, which is, what is different or unique about innovation, transparency, collaboration once we're talking about AI? Is there anything that's specific to a context around AI that we should talk about, that we should know about?
I can share the example of PyTorch Foundation. That is one of the initiative I'm also working at Linux Foundation. So I think there is open source is not just on software, but if of course something that has a lot of value, and this collaboration has a lot of value when working on open source models and training, open data, and so on. And in PyTorch Foundation, for instance, we're building this ecosystem of collaboration, not just at collaboration for PyTorch core, but also building this ecosystem on the domain level, like for training data, inference, agents, agent systems, and so on, and also on the vertical level, like for AI machine learning models for geospatial ecosystem and scope. So I do think there is an extension on this collaboration that applies not just to software, but also data and training models and what defines an open source AI model that is also being taken in open source foundations. And for instance, in my case at PyTorch Foundations, for the specific ecosystem of the machine learning framework, PyTorch is something that we are developing, and many organizations are coming there together to work on common tooling so organizations can reduce cost and reduce this friction of building something from scratch and have this transparency and open collaboration benefits of that is.
Fabulous. That is the time that we have. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for being on the panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.